In this video, I'm going to be making some modifications to my drill press. Here we go again. Yeah, I got to break in and ask why you're doing this. There's nothing wrong with the drill press as it is. You know, you did a bunch of stuff to it before. Why don't you leave it like that and make some real projects? No, you never did get it. You know what? That's the funny part, because it's not that difficult. I just want to try to get the most out of what I have. Okay. And people like watching that. Look, knock yourself out. I'm not going to help though. I'm going to go do a real project. Whatever, man. Instead of, once again, reinventing the wheel with you. Yeah, you can do that. I'm going to stay here and I'm going to do the modifications on my drill press like I talked about. And you're not allowed back in. So I don't know where you're going to do this so-called work. You're not going to be doing it in here, so get out. Do you see what I got to deal with here? Anyway, step number one is to get rid of all the stuff that's on here. And that includes the metal table, so I'm going to have to take the top off the drill press as well. And while you're watching me do that, I'm going to talk briefly about what I'm looking to accomplish here. I want to replace the metal table with a vise that's adjustable in and out, and also up and down. And the up and down will be controlled by a motorized actuator. And there will be a table. It'll actually be the old table, but instead of sitting on the metal table, it'll be clamped in that vise. Certainly a lot easier to put it on again than taking it off. And just to get it roughly in position, I'm squaring it to the wall. The base on this is kind of fixed, so it's not going to turn. And then I can tighten up those screws and carry on with the rest of the build. I'm going to be boxing the column with plywood on 3 sides, so I need to know how long the pieces need to be, and also the diameter of the column, so I can cut those parts to the right size. To put this together, I'm just going to use some 18 gauge brads. It's going to get screwed directly to the column, so it really doesn't need anything more than that. And the plywood that I'm using here is good quality. It's 1/2 inch Baltic birch. But I think any high quality plywood would work for this. Now, like the head, I'm just going to square off the wall to get it lined up, and then I'll be able to clamp it in place while I drill holes for the screws that will fasten it to the column. The screws that I'm using here are number 10, and the head can't be above the surface, so I'm making a counter bore first. I just got a really interesting idea. Yeah, what's that? Well, rather than build the entire project and then make the video at the end, what I want to do is make a video, post that on Patreon for my supporters, and then the next day I'll build some more, make another short video, and post that on Patreon as well. And at the end of it all, I'll take all of those shorter videos and I'll put them together and I'll post them here on my main channel. Okay, so what do you think? Is this something that we can finally agree on? Yeah, I gotta hand it to you. That is actually one of your better ideas. I'll still be putting the full build video here, but this will give you the opportunity to watch it earlier in bite-sized pieces. Next, I need to make a carriage that fits around that boxed-in column. And I'm gonna use 3/4 inch plywood for the sides, 1/2 inch plywood for the front, and then 2 more pieces of 3/4 inch plywood for the back. They'll leave a gap in between so that this thing can be tightened on the column. To figure out how wide the front piece needs to be, I'm going to take the two side pieces and clamp them in place against the column, and then measure across, and that'll give me the width. And then to assemble this, I'm not going to be using any glue. Instead, I'm going to be using screws, but first I'm going to drive in some 23 gauge pins to hold the parts in line while I drill the pilot holes for the screws. With that much put together, it should slip right on the column and slide up and down without getting hung up. And of course, if it's too tight, you can make adjustments because it's not glued. And while it's on there, I'm going to clamp it in place and use a very sharp pencil to mark the back edge. And this is where those narrow pieces of 3/4 inch plywood will fasten. Once again, I'm not going to use glue. I'm just going to clamp the strip in place, flip it over, drill the pilot holes, and drive the screws. So I'm going to mark these back cleats on the top, so I'll be able to put them back in where they came from, and then I'll slip the carriage onto the column and reinstall the cleats. Up until this point, I've been doing this with the drill press still in place up against the wall, but now I think I really need to pull it out so I can get all the way around it, especially on the back. The next thing I want to do is mount the mechanism that raises and lowers this, and I need full access to do that. And then I had to figure out how I was going to mount the actuator. So I'm starting with a piece of 1/2 inch plywood that I'm going to mount the actuator on. And there are two mounting brackets, but they're not in the same plane. So I need to add a shim. And then to locate the holes properly, I'm going to drill all the way through the bracket and then position that over the shim and drill through the shim and the plywood. The other bracket is off the end of the plywood, and that's going to mount on another piece of plywood that's going to be glued and screwed to the strip. Now I'm going to take that bracket off so that I can use that to drill the holes. And I can get the other end screwed on as well. But the white thing is the part that goes up and down, and that needs to be fastened to the cradle that we just put on the column. And the bolts that were in here originally are a little bit too short, and also they appear to be metric, but the threading on this 3/8 inch bolt is close enough, and it's also long enough. I figured out how high this needs to go roughly, and I laid out the holes for the 3/8 inch bolts. I'm going to drill those now, and then drive those bolts in. And then I can screw the assembly on the bottom to the column boxing and actually try it out and see if it works. Those 3/8 inch bolts are pretty strong, but I'm also going to glue on these small blocks of solid wood so that the carriage is pressing directly on that white piece of plastic. Like I said in the beginning of the video, I want to put a vise on this drill press. And the one that I decided to use is my gear connected one that has 2 screws so it doesn't rack. So I'm going to get that pulled off over here where I've never used it. I'm going to take the mounting plate off, and I'm going to take out these screws that are around the holes that the threaded rod goes through. These are the larger pads on the back that hold the nuts in place and make it possible to do fine adjustments on this. Next thing I need to do is cut a couple of dados on the back of that mounting plate. So once again, rather than putting faith in measurements, I'm going to clamp it in place and use a very sharp pencil to mark those lines on there. Now before I cut those dados, I'm going to cut the rails that will fit into them. And I want to make absolutely sure that what I've got here is square before I make the cuts. Now for the dado cuts, I need to do one side at a time, nibbling away the material until I get a perfect fit. The hole that I'm drilling here is for a 3/8 inch threaded rod. That's going to go all the way through this, and it will clamp the carriage tight on the column and also clamp the vise in place when it's been adjusted in or out. Next, I need to cut slots in the rails that I just made, and that's for the threaded rod that will go all the way through and clamp everything tight. Now that I have the slots cut, I can glue the rails into those dados, and I'm using polyurethane construction adhesive and spreading it all over the dados. I want to make sure that I wind up with a good strong joint. And I'm going to clamp it down to the corner of my table saw, get 2 on the top, and then use a caul to put on 2 more. I also cut a scrap of plywood to the exact right size to go in between the rails to make sure that they stay 90 degrees. I let the glue dry on the rails overnight. Now I need to make the cleats that support it, top and bottom. And the bottom cleat is going to be mostly plywood, but I'm also going to add a strip of slippery plastic to it. So that's what I'm cutting here. And the top cleat is smaller, so I'm just going to make that completely from slippery plastic. Then I can get the backer plate assembly clamped onto the carriage in the right spot and install the cleats starting on the top. I can't glue these cleats on even if I wanted to, so instead I'm going to use a lot of screws to keep them from moving. Now the wider cleats on the bottom need a hole for the head of that bolt that screws into the actuator. Then I can get the thin strip of plastic fastened on the top and get it mounted on the carriage. Once again, I'm going to use a lot of screws here. There are 2 points on here that are going to see the most stress, and that's the bottom cleat on the front and the upper cleat at the back. So I'm just going to remove one of those screws and replace it with a 1/4 inch bolt. Yeah, I guess not bad. Yeah, really? But you know what? I would have done differently. I would have made those. I decided that the lead screws on the vise were too long. I really don't need that much capacity for a drill press. And to be honest, I don't think I ever did. So this opens up to about 6 inches, and that'll be plenty. If you haven't seen this vise before, I've got a video showing how I made it. I've also got plans available that you can buy to make your own if you're up for the challenge. Next, I'm going to start working on the clamping mechanism that clamps the vise in place. And so I designed this fancy hand wheel to cut out on the CNC. I'm going to need 2 of these. This first one will be for the tightening side, and it's going to have a 1/2 inch nut glued in so that when you turn the wheel, it clamps the vise in place. Now on the other side, I have another hand wheel that's exactly the same, but what that does is it moves the vise in and out. And to make that happen, I actually salvaged 2 parts from the old drill press stuff that I already took off, and that's the pinion gear that you use to raise and lower the metal table, and also the rack. I'm going to be cutting a short piece of that and fastening it to the vise rail. But the first thing I need to do is get that pinion gear glued into another plate, and while the glue may hold it, I'm also drilling holes here to put pins through to reinforce it. And yes, I'm using the drill press to do that. Hot. Even though I did quite a lot of planning before I got started here, this is very much a design on the fly project. And what that means is that you make mistakes and then you fix mistakes. And here's one right here. I didn't have enough clearance for this plate to sit on top, so I have to recess it in. I also need to cut the rack that I took off the drill press. That's the one that was all bent up and clamped in place. And I need to fasten this to a piece of wood, so I'm drilling a couple of holes. one on each end. A little bit tricky in between the teeth there, and I don't want to break off the bit, so I'll switch to a step drill, and that'll get it done. Now I can get the rack fastened to the rail with a couple of 1.5 inch screws and put the hand wheel in place and see if it actually works. Now I can get the pins glued into that spur gear. These are just 2-inch nails that I cut to the right length. I need to add this strip to support the back of the wheel. When the other side tightens, I want the pressure to be on this strip of wood and the rack above, and not pushing the spur gear into the rail. To keep the rails from racking at the back and also spreading apart, I'm going to add a plate that's the right size, or at least it will be, to tie the two sides together. Before I go any further, I need to do a little bit of wire management on the back. These go to the actuator, and I made a mounting bracket to keep them out of the way. Okay, so the way that this works is that I'll use the wheel on the left side to adjust the vise in and out, and then you tighten the wheel on the right to lock it in place. With all the major stuff figured out and built, I took it apart again so I can finish the parts. And most of that was clear polyurethane, but I did paint some parts black, including the column on the inside. It was a bit rusty and unsightly looking. I thought it would clean it up, and it looks really good now. While I was waiting for the finish to dry, I made this bracket to mount the up-down button in, and that gets screwed to the plywood boxing at the top of the column. Now that everything's put back on, I can work on the table, and now would be a great time to build a new one. But I already did that a couple years ago, so I'm just going to modify the one I have. To use this table, I need to knock off these blocks, and I also need to add a cleat to the bottom that will be clamped in the vise. I often get comments asking why I use construction adhesive, and right here I think you can see the reason. That's what this block is glued on with, and man, it doesn't let go. Now I can either take out the bolts that go through the table, or I can use them to fasten a cleat. I'm going to mark it and drill a counterbore on one side, and then drill through holes through the other side that are a little bit bigger than the bolt. Then I can get some glue on there and bolt it down. After I tighten the vise, I can see that it's racked a little bit too much vertically. So to fix that, I'm going to add a block to the bottom of that cleat that extends down near the bottom of the vise, and that'll stop that from happening. A good place to put the power supply for the lift is right here on this back panel. And I can get the wire connected and take up a little bit of the slack, but I need to make sure I leave enough here for the carriage to move up and down. And the only thing left to do is plug it in and try it out. say, Johnny boy, this is amazing. Well, thanks. I'm glad you changed your mind. It took you long enough, though, I've got to say. It's almost a month later. I mean, if you had helped out, it would have went a lot faster. Oh, you know what? I would have helped if your attitude had been better. In fact, I would have been glad to help out if you had have listened to me. I had some really good ideas to improve it, to make it even better. Yeah, I know all about your ideas. They never work. Okay, no problem at all. If I know anything about you, in about 6 months, you're going to be changing it again anyway. So we'll put in my ideas then. How about that?